I've always been a big fan of the stories of children, because I find them to be...
Yes. I find children more and more interesting as I get older and more fun.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, their face expressions are so open as about what they're thinking or how they're feeling. Well, adults are too, but they're not as much fun.
Right.
They're usually just looking tense.
Right.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and start recording. That's
What is it you want now? What is your goal here?
I would love it if we could please focus mostly on the murals. I know you've already talked to us off camera about that.
I can do it again.
Essentially, that's what we're...
I've done films and videos where we did the whole thing and I forgot to turn the camera on.
Been there.
We had to do it all again.
Right.
But that's not as bad. I know a lot of photographers because they love because they're visual artists.
Mm-hmm.
I know one guy who's a professional and went with his assistant to Alabama to do a shoot and got there and found out he'd forgotten his film in Atlanta. And I thought, somebody that doesn't know these guys couldn't believe that a professional could do that. And I thought, yeah, that's just typical, Forget the film, forget the camera. Yeah, and when we went to Gothenburg that time, we had a little mat to do our act on. And as we were about to get the train in Sweden, I stopped at a park bench and to tie my shoe and left the mat, of course. So we found out, and we didn't really need it, but strangely enough, a few minutes later, a friend of ours in Sweden came by that park bench and saw our mat and took it and put it in his apartment. So that's life for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
It wasn't that important, but it's always good to know somebody's there.
Get you back.
Yes, now the expression is, get your back.
Yeah.
We got you back.
Get your back.
Yeah, so it's going to be a little redundant, but if you could, and a little bit on the sterile side initially, but if you could please tell us your name and a little of your background, please.
Okay, tell me when you're rolling.
Rolling.
Okay, my name is Steve Seaberg, and I was a friend of Esther Lefevre and worked with her both with music and on the CSX Cabbage Town wall mural, as we called it, to try to make it clear what it was. And we had first met because we both had kids in a progressive preschool. And it wasn't long after a parents' meeting, because the school was run by the parents, that we found out that we both played the guitar and sang. So it wasn't long before we were performing at parties, and eventually she and I had almost a regular gig at a coffee shop called the Common Cup, it was called, in the old Red Cross building on Peachtree Street. And often we played and sang with Joyce Brookshire, whom she had met in Cabbage Town through her music, of course. And when the Patch, which is this place she invented to be a kind of kids club, turned into a ceramic studio and had all sorts of different manifestations. I got a job making this mural, which was to beautify the wall, which otherwise would have been just a gray monstrosity along Wiley Street. And she actually made the tiles that were put up there using my drawings as the models for each of the pictures. So we spent about 2 years working on that, plus putting it up with the two brothers who were the tile setters that were up on scaffolding, putting the actual tiles on the wall. And we decided that the tiles should be about a foot square, otherwise it would take us forever. And there were no other tile murals in Atlanta. I drove around trying to find examples of what it might look with, and the only mural anywhere that I could find was a tiny ceramic mural. I think, what is it? It's the street that now is right next to the King Center station. It goes under the tracks down toward Memorial Drive, and on the south side of that viaduct bridge, there is a tiny ceramic design about that big. So that wasn't much help. So every panel, as we called them, was going to have, I think it was 12 by 16 feet. So whatever that came out to be, 12 times 16, that's how many tiles there were. And she could only make them like 5 at a time because they took up a lot of space on her table. And we had to figure out ways to do them all at once. And so she couldn't use little tiny brushes anymore. She had to sweep the brush across the whole thing. And we worked on this style that it was going to have quite a lot. And it was very successful. It looks like almost exactly like my originals, where I used about 1 inch, a paintbrush like that, so I could make a really wide mark. Boy, is this getting technical. Let's move on. And so anyway, it took us a year. It went all year firing these things. And finally, before we'd even finished making them, they were being put up. I don't even think I designed all of them. So already they were going up, and the 2 brothers that were putting them up, I can't remember their name, it was a Polish name. After about 2 panels got into an argument with each other, and one of them quit. And that wasn't much of a help, you know, and we had a deadline and all that stuff anyway. So I would go over and drive over and sit in the stand underneath and watch them put them up. And each one had a label on the back saying which was up and what the number of the tile was. So they would look at the back, put the cement on and put it in place in order, little one by one. And as I watched this one day, I didn't go very often, but I was watching, I saw one of the guys pick it up. He was way up in the air and start to put it up, and it was sideways. I could see from the ground that it was now crooked. And I shouted, "No, no, you know, that's crooked, turn it to the right." And without any comment, he just gave it a quarter turn and put it up. And if I hadn't been there, that would, of course, gone up wrong. Well, it turned out that there was one tile of all the hundreds of tiles that was wrong. And you can see it, but you have to look for it. You have to know that it's there. So it was amazing that they got them. Every other one was put up correctly. And finally, when the thing was open, we had a party. And the officials came from the railroad in their coats and ties, looking exactly like corporate gentlemen. But they were moved, they were touched. I guess that's absolutely the right word. They didn't weep over it, but almost like they said we had never imagined that the railroad, which they considered obviously something really unartistic, could ever be the subject of art. Well, of course, they didn't know the history of art, that a lot of people like Turner had made paintings called Wind, Smoke, and Speed and stuff like that, of speeding locomotives. But anyway, they were terribly pleased, not only that had they gotten to build their piggyback yard, which was in doubt until the Urban Design Commission approved it. But anyway, they actually got to look at pictures that I guess gave some attention to the CSX railroad. So they took the little bus tour that went up and down Wiley Street all afternoon showing people. And we had a party that afternoon in which Joyce sang, and a guy sang who looked a lot like Fiddlin' John Carson, whose portrait is in panel number 7, but wasn't. But they sang stuff like, you know, "This little light of mine," and "Glory, glory, glory, the hand of God has touched me," and it's really neat. And Joyce and Esther sang, and they didn't sing a song though that we often sang together, which is called "Hard Times Cotton Mill Girls," that it was, I think, written by a woman who taught at Oglethorpe University back in the 20s about the women that worked in the cotton mill. Now, Joyce's mother had worked in the cotton mill, and she said, "Can't you make a panel showing my mother in the cotton mill?" Well, I did, and that's panel number 1. That's next to the what's called the Fulton Bag Mill. The Fulton Mill, which is now a condominium, which is one of the strangest things I can think of, was used by some of us when we went for a big art show back before the mural was ever put up, called the Mattress Factory Show. And we had to put in our own electricity and sweep it up. And I remember a guy coming in saying, "Can I be in the show?" And we said, "Yeah, just grab a broom and sweep up a place and that'll be yours." Anyway, when the show opened, there were some guys that set up a table at the entrance on not Moreland Boulevard, showing how in a few months this would become a condominium. And I looked at that and I thought, this is the weirdest, most avant-garde thing in the art show. What a crazy idea that this place will become condominiums. And within a year it was condominiums. And the rest of the artists, I don't know, have all died of poverty since then, but you know, the condominium people have prospered over this. Anyway, that was sometimes before the Cabbage Town show. What else do you want me to say? I mean, I want to try to stick to the subject and not wander off into art shows I have known in Atlanta or crazy things that have happened in Cabbage Town. Well, I'll tell you the crazy thing that happened is when they started to put graffiti on the wall. And I had said, when people said they're going to put graffiti on your pictures, I said, no, they're not. They're going to respect them. That's what artists will do, at least at this time. Which they did. Nobody ever painted over. Sometimes they paint over an edge, but they never put anything directly on top of them. But it was pretty startling to see that it was now hard to find them in all of the other painting, some of which is pretty good. I'm not a big graffiti fan, but I have to say that some of the art on the wall is pretty well done. And I'm glad that artists get to do stuff. There's no doubt about it that that's good for everybody. Culture, that is, as long as they don't paint over mine. But since mine are ceramic tile, it will be there forever. And eventually the graffiti will wear off because it just isn't that permanent. So that was a shocking moment. And then when the trees grew in front of everything, I mean, not just little trees, but big trees. And the one at the turn of the steam engine at the park there, you couldn't even see it. The bushes now it was impenetrable jungle. I think now it's been cut down, but they're slowly growing back, but that's okay. I couldn't police this. I had other things to do in my life than see that this mural was not obscured by the trees. Pretty funny. But when I went into one of these new cafes on Carroll Street, I suddenly thought, I've been in this room before. And I thought, my God, it's the Patch. Well, it turned out not to be. I don't think the Carroll Street Cafe is the Patch, is it?
No, Carroll Street Cafe was an artist studio and like Panorama Ray had a studio.
Okay, but the Patch is next door, isn't it?
The Patch is on the corner of Boulevard and Carroll Street. It's actually right next to where our center is, so it's now
but it's
Agave.
only a few feet from from the Carroll Street Cafe.
Okay, yes, so you're talking, yes. So the Patch also had an office. It had its tile work being done in what is now Agave Restaurant, but the Patch
That's
also...
where, of course,
yes.
we did the tiles.
Yes,
I
tiles
believe.
and the crafts were there, but there was a house that's now Orange House just a couple of doors down from Carroll Street Cafe where they also had the Patch offices.
That I had no connection with. I didn't know about that.
That was a little early. That was early on.
It must have been. No, I never was there. I was only in the place that was like a storefront.
Yes, which is now Agave Restaurant.
Okay, good, you told me.
But if we may, please go to this notebook that you had shown us earlier. you were talking about some of the design elements and some of the details about the tiles.
Well, an important thing about the mural is that as I watch other murals put up, in Atlanta, I see artists brought in these mural programs from other countries, like a guy from France is doing something on University Avenue, and the lady that put the paintings up down on McDonough near the penitentiary, and everybody complained, and neighbors were out painting over the murals on University Avenue, and then other neighbors were coming out and washing off the paintings that were covering them, you know. Well, I never got into that trouble, even though I've had lots of problems in my life with people censoring my art. I didn't in this case because I actually asked the people in the neighborhood what they would like to see on the wall. So the picture of the woman in the factory, which is this one right there, this is not a good picture, this just shows where it is. There is the bag mill right behind it. I mean, I was painting pictures of stuff I could actually see where it was going to be. Well, that was Joyce Brookshire's mother, and I thought that's a neat idea. I got a photo of her mother and put her mother in the bag factory. I'm trying to find a close-up of it, but I don't see it right away. Anyway, then she said, how about a picture of Fiddlin' John Carson, who was a famous country musician that came from Cabbage Town. Although, like so many people from Cabbage Town, his family had originally come from someplace like LEJ or North Georgia. So I took some artist liberties and made this, I'll never find it, this boxcar that's at Krog Street, and put Fiddlin' John Carson and his niece or friend Moonshine Kate in the boxcar. No wonder I put these all in upside down. I'm so sorry, this is ridiculous. I should have, I thought I was completely prepared for this, and you see, I really am not. Here are the guys putting up the tiles, the two brothers, before they got mad at each other and one of them quit. And that's an interesting story, not much, well, that's a story of art. And so Fiddlin' John, I had never even heard Fiddlin' John play, and I never met him. But it was a big success to put it there because everybody knew who he was. So people were proud of the stuff in the mural, and the CSX people were pleased that the railroad had become a subject for art. Hell of a book that I can't even find. Anyway, it was a big success for that reason, that I had gone to the trouble to talk to the people and had, lived not far from it myself, rather than come in and slap my art on some neighborhood that didn't understand it and didn't want it. I think that's a good point to make about this mural.
Absolutely. So you may have been hearing stories that CSX might sell this property, and so the future of that whole area is uncertain.
No, I haven't, or I have, but I've heard it some time ago, as I remember it. So nothing has happened, and I'm not holding my breath for it. Whatever that would mean for the wall, I have no idea. And I mean, it's hard to imagine what that's going to be up there. I suppose condominiums. I don't know what, why. you know, they'd probably keep the wall. Something's got to hold up. The wall is holding the railroad yard up, actually. I mean, it's not just there to separate Cabbage Town, but that would have been it. It's higher in there. It's 20 feet higher than Cabbage Town at different levels. And how it was held up before, I don't know. It was always a railroad yard. It was called the Halsey Yard. And one of the videos I sent you a link to was me doing a performance piece with a wooden skeleton in the Halsey Yard way before the wall was ever built. I mean, so I was already there, so to speak, in one form or another. So do they say what it's going to be? Anybody?
It's completely uncertain. There's a lot of conjecture. Yes, it looks like one of the major developers is interested, which could mean, like you said, it could be condominiums. It's because it falls outside of the historic landmark guidelines.
Oh, absolutely.
So pretty much sky's the limit, as it were.
Yep.
But what that, how that would affect the art that's on the wall or the wall itself.
No telling. The reason that the Urban Design Commission had to approve this in the first place was that it faced a historic district. If that had been just a street anywhere, they would have had no control over it. And even though it's private property, anything that impinges on, say, an historic district has to be approved by the Urban Design Commission. That's how that happened. They also would approve a thing like the city prison. So when I was on the Urban Design Commission, the plans for the prison, which is across from the Garnet MARTA station, came up, and all of the architects and lawyers on the committee all nodded and said, "Oh, it looks pretty good, okay with us." And I raised my hand and I said, "Why does it have to look so grim?" That was the kind of question I asked when I was on the community. I thought we ought to bring a little humanity. There was this terrible silence, like, what? And then one of the architects got his wits to him and said, "Because it's a prison," he said. And he had me there. I wasn't ready for that. I said, "Okay, well, that's a reason. Why does it look so grim?" So, in fact, I'm sorry to get off the subject a little bit. This is another pretty good story. At one meeting of the Urban Design Commission also approved all of the MARTA stations. Well, many had been built, and I never was an artist that did a MARTA station, and I was certainly satisfied with the wall. That was enough for my public art contribution. So artists would come up, and one couple of women showed us a proposal for some station like at Dunwoody or somewhere. And it wasn't very good. It looked like arts and crafts to me. It wasn't, it's just like squares and things. And so when we were asked for our opinion, I said, well, I didn't think I wanted to approve it because I didn't think it was art. And there was this incredible silence. And it turned out nobody had ever used the word art before in that context, to say that this isn't art and we shouldn't look at it. And they went ahead and approved it anyway, I believe. And the next day I got a call from the people that sort of managed the committee, and they said, "Oh, well, Steve, we've found out that you're supposed to have been on the committee for a year, and we haven't noticed. The year was up several months ago, so it's time for you to step down." Well, they wouldn't have thought of that unless I'd brought up this problem of art, and they didn't want to hear that anymore. So that was the end of me, on the committee. My other problem would have been, of course, when I got the job of making the wall art. You want me to tell this story? I was on this design commission as the only artist. There was always an artist on it, and several of my friends had been on it. And we had to approve of anything that had to do with a historic district or public building, including MARTA stations. We had to approve of them. So CSX came with their plans for this wall, and it was just this gray concrete thing, and I said, I think it ought to have art on it. And everybody nodded and said, yes, we'll approve it if it has art on it. And that put CSX, they had to find art for it. So the next day they, of course, called me and said, would you like to do this? And I thought, this is a little strange, but yes. I know I don't get paid for being on the committee, but they would pay me. So immediately when it appeared somehow on the AJC that I have never been on the front page of the AJC before, but I was now somebody who was like a typical politician, was using my political position for private gain. And it was quite a long article. They really dragged me through the mud. It was quite exciting. And one of my artist friends said that I was the only artist in Atlanta that could get on the front page of the AJC, no matter how I did it. So anyway, my friends on the committee had to have a meeting and decide if I'd be kicked off. And I went and sat in another room like a first grader had been punished. And after half an hour, they called me back and said, well, you said when you saw this that there ought to be art on it, but they said Steve always says there should be art in every project, so you hadn't planned on this, as a way of getting this job. So I was exonerated, and an article appeared in the AJC about my exoneration, but it was on page 52, not on the front page. Anyway, who cared? I went ahead and did the job, and also, but I was finally removed from the committee for this other thing about talking about something not being art. But in the meantime, I learned a great deal from my lawyer and architect friends about structure, and it was a great job because they did discuss how things are built. But they also got jobs. One of them also did a MARTA station, and I didn't see them being questioned about, whether they were abusing their position. Anyway, that's not important. But anyway, so the whole thing was not without minor scandal, which I think is okay. I mean, art should, be out there, pushing the envelope, whatever the envelope is that we're pushing. And let's see, what do you think of other?
Have you done any other art projects in or around Cabbage Town and or with Esther?
Well, really our only other project was singing together at the Common Cup. Sort of called a art project. I mean, we both of us, Esther was the daughter of a Mennonite bishop, actually, from Pennsylvania, and had strong religious ties, and I think that her whole attitude toward helping people in Cabbage Town came from this background of religious service. And I too, although I had more of a connection with religion than I usually think about, but I remember going to Sunday school year after year and getting all these little pins and realizing that my parents never seemed to go to church at all, that I was always the one that was in church. And it was because of one of my grandmothers who had been a student at a rather famous place in Chicago called the Moody Bible Institute, and had played the guitar on street corners, and saved souls. And I have the feeling she told my parents that she wanted me to go to Sunday school. I also had a grandfather who was a Baptist minister, and I realized I too had a pretty well built-in attitude toward service, I guess is what you'd call it, and that Esther and I really connected without really discussing it at all on this level, both in our art and the idea of making a mural that sort of featured Cabbage Town, its real roots and real people, definitely came from this kind of philosophy. And I think playing at this Common Cup, which was run by a religious organization called Exodus, and was meant to be a kind of meeting place. Well, the name, the Common Cup, tells it all. Although Esther and I would definitely have a glass of wine now and then, it wasn't maybe the kind of common cup that they meant. The coffee cup is really what they meant. Anyway, Esther and I, and finally Bob Waymer, played there a lot. And we played a lot of social meaning folk songs, like, about coal mining and protest songs. We were very good at that. Although we sang some songs that were like tiny bubbles. I don't know what that was protesting. I think it was about champagne. Anyway, all of this, so I realized, it's actually isn't until right now I realized this connection. I'd never thought of it before with religious public service. And I knew little about the Mennonites, but Esther belonged to this Mennonite community that had all moved in to Inman Park. Don Bender, her cousin, was one of these people, bought up property and tried to improve the neighborhood, which they did. They started what's now called the Corner Pub or something. I mean, that was started by Don and his friends as a kind of meeting place too for people. They served food, and the idea was not, to go there and get slammed, but to go and meet your neighbors. So I met Don and all those people that Esther was connected with, and she lived only a couple blocks away on Oakdale or some local street. Interesting. Yeah, that's a good story.
Well, we're glad we could be here when you.
Yeah, thank you. This isn't the first time. One of my friends said, he says, Steve, you don't know what you're thinking until you hear yourself say it. It's like painting. I don't know. Most painters don't know what they're doing until they see it on the canvas. And I'm no different with all my theories when I paint or when I talk. Apparently, I don't know what it's going to be until I start to talk it out. And I wrote an article once about child abuse and its effect on, this is another one of my incarnations, on art of the world. I mean, there's so many people that I knew in the arts community that were the children of alcoholics, including myself, and how I could see it was affecting their art, because it made it both good and bizarre. So I started researching this, and finally wrote an article which appeared in a rather prestigious magazine called Leonardo, put out by MIT. It was supposed to be their culture magazine. So I wrote an article called The Demon's Face, and it was really about the appearance in many works of art of a kind of hidden face that was the face of this abuse, I finally decided. I mean, I found it often in my own art. It was like something that was there. And while writing the article, I suddenly realized I had to forgive the parent who was the abuser drunk. Not physical, but just, not there because of the addiction. So in the middle of the article, I say I must forgive my father, I realized at this moment, which I did. And from then on, a lot of my own crazy behavior stopped. Like the time a little white poodle barked at me as I was walking to work with a briefcase a block or two away from here, and I got angry and started to chase the poodle with the intention of hitting it with the briefcase, until I realized after a few steps that this really would look quite strange to my neighbors, all who knew me. A grown man running down the street swinging a briefcase at a white fluffy little dog. And I thought, why did I do that? Well, it was some sort of anger at something, and I realized it must be at my father, and I'm taking it out now at the age of 60 or some. I still haven't grown up. I'm still this abused child. And so that's where that started, that I realized that a lot of my actions were being dictated, including my art, by some other forces. So when I finally wrote this article and saw this right before my eyes, I realized that he too had been a victim, and going around blaming anybody for this was just a waste of time. But I didn't know that until I'd seen it written on the page, and I didn't realize this thing about my religious background until I started to talk about it. I knew I had to talk about Esther's Mennonite background because it's so interesting. I mean, that she had to, and then I started to put two and two together and realize that I was involved too from that point of view. And you look at me so seriously, you probably are too. No, you don't have to. You don't have to investigate your own minds now. You don't have to, sorry.
Oh no, we're always investigating our minds.
Yeah, I could sort of figured that out. You knew you were.
You may have mentioned this already. I know how you say you met Esther, but do you know how Esther got involved with Cabbage Town in the first place?
I would say that she met Joyce somewhere. Or something, some singing thing, because that's how she and I met, over music. She came in to entertain the kids at the school by playing her guitar. And how it actually happened with Joyce, I don't know, but I would say that it was through that art form that she found Joyce. I mean, she may have been to go to Cabbage Town looking for people and music. She could do that. But I don't know other than that. I just have to guess.
Sorry.
It's a terrible hay fever.
I was just holding back.
My daughter's dogs have hay fever today. It's so bad. She said they have crusty eyes, and she said they lie on the floor with the yellow pollen on their noses. And, oh, don't start me.
Sorry,
Okay.
sorry. I know, it's contagious. Well,
I have a question.
please.
You don't have it, Nina?
No.
Oh, lucky you. I didn't have it. I got over it at 13. But in the last 2 years in Atlanta, it's come back.
Yeah, it's.
Other people that never had it, but like a doctor friend of mine says he never had it in his life until recently.
Until now, exactly.
Yeah.
So my question, when you were talking about being exonerated, if you had not been chosen to do the wall, what do you think the wall would have looked like?
It would have just been a gray thing.
You don't think they would have proceeded with a different type of artwork?
No,
or,
no,
it would
nobody.
just been just
CSX never would have thought of this. They had only one idea at CSX, and that was to build the yard. They had had a terrible time already getting it approved because nobody wanted it. There's the wall without anything on it, isn't it? I don't have my glasses on. Just concrete. It would have been 3 or 4 blocks of concrete with trees in front of it, and the trees would have that was their plan, I think, is to have some trees. No, maybe one of the architects thought that up. I don't think they wouldn't have thought of that. CSX, those guys' minds are really blank about anything. But even these 12 by 16 foot panels look tiny on that wall. I mean, it's just an enormous space. They are the biggest murals in Atlanta still, but they don't look that big because what they're on. I mean, ones other than graffiti murals. And for years and years, there was no graffiti. There was absolutely nobody thought to do that. They kept it under the bridge for some reason. The graffiti artists, most graffiti in Atlanta started in viaducts, like there, and there's another viaduct all the viaducts, even though it's dark in there.
Did you visit Cabbage Town often?
Well, during this period, yes, of course. But I've been there for other reasons. Once the circus did the Cabbage Town festival, whatever it's called, which I now hear is so big that they don't have enough people to volunteer to run it.
The reunion? The
No,
Cabbage Town
Chomp
reunion? Or
and
Chomp and Stomp?
Yeah, the Chomp
Chomp
and
and Stomp
Stomp.
is huge.
I mean, people in Atlanta love festivals, and the Inman Park Festival, you can't park. I went over to be in the parade on the train. I mean, the trains were packed, and I mean, people are looking for this kind of entertainment. I mean, they're really starved for.
Well, that is essentially the culture that we have. It's our festivals.
Hello? Hi, Bob. Yeah, thanks for calling. Can I call you back? Unless it's something I have to know about at this very moment. I've got some people here. Is that okay? I wonder if that was Bob.
Wrong person.
Wrong Bob.
Wrong Bob.
I'm so doubtful. I know it's Bob. What the hell was it?
Have you gotten to do any other tiles since
No.
this project?
No. No, it was not a big career step for me in any way. It was not. Well, none of this it hasn't been for anybody. I mean, art is really, you know, I mean, Atlanta's tried, but, and it's got a lot more art than it used to, but it still is. I mean, so many of my friends have one piece somewhere. Like at 5 Points, there's this strange steel sculpture that looks like some industrial thing by George Beasley. And I don't think there's anything else in town that I know of that George has done. I mean, we've all gotten to do sort of one thing. And some of them are interesting and others are pretty boring. The whole mural thing in Atlanta is interesting. It started in the 70s, and at first there were no black artists. I mean, amazing. And I would go around and say to the people that were running the project, I said, you know, they're all white people who are instructors at the College of Art or at Georgia State. And they got really mad at me. You know, got really annoyed that I said that to them. Finally, they got a mural up by Romare Bearden, and he was the most acceptable black artist they could find, and it was put up downtown, and it was taken down only a few years later. It isn't there anymore. None of the murals are. So, and then some black artists started doing them in other parts of town on their own property, given to them by somebody they knew, you know, but it was all definitely to the side. It was not officially recognized. And it's still, there are some, I think the Auburn Library may have some, but it was scandalous, you know, how segregated the art scene was. Georgia State had only the AU Center had black artists teaching there. Georgia State didn't have them. Curtis Patterson taught at the College of Art, and he has one piece of sculpture, which is over here in the park. But otherwise, it was very segregated. And then came the time they realized they had to change, and they had a black chairman of the art department at Georgia State suddenly, a guy named Walker, whose daughter now is quite well known. Her name is Carol Walker, and she's quite well known for doing silhouettes, I'll bet you, which look like antebellum South silhouettes, but they're all black people with antebellum costumes on. They're pretty funny. And she and her father were both God, I can't stay away from this. This is so gossipy. We're in a show that I did called Children of Abuse. We did a show called Children of Alcoholism, in which I said, everybody and if you have come from an alcoholic family, you can be in the show. And there were about 19 people in it, and it was really interesting. It was so interesting that I wrote a book called The Iconography of Abuse about the symbolism in it. And then I realized there were so many other people that had other abusive backgrounds that 2 years later we had a show called children of abuse, and then we had 75 works of art in it. And people came from all over the city with stuff, and some of that art was really just incredible and excruciating too. And it was people that had physical abuse, parents who narcotic abuse, and people that I discovered religious abuse, the children of ministers, who would be told that not only do I disapprove of you, but so does God, which is really heavy-duty stuff, you know. Anyway, Kara Walker was in that show, and it was not my business to pry into people's private lives and say, like they would say about the daughters in the American Revolution, who's your hero? Meaning, who is your ancestor that makes you a daughter? Like we say, who's your drunk? You know, I didn't ask Kara who her drunk was. But the next day her father, the chairman of the art department, showed up with his work of art. So here we had both Kara and her father in it. And if her father was in it, I mean, it's possible that Kara's father could have been the alcoholic, but Kara couldn't have been his. There was some more alcoholics in this picture of the Walker family, but as I say, it's not my business. Even now, it's sort of not my business to discuss that aspect. And I don't know how many people now would admit that they'd been in such a show. I think that a lot of people would like to say, no, I was never in such a show, never. We had a performance that went with it that was also incredible. One artist got up, took all her clothes off and broke a bag above her full of red paint, which fell from the ceiling all over her naked body. And she was very white and very pink looking, white. And here she is cut. It was utterly incredible experience. It was like, and my wife was sitting in the front row and everybody got splashed with this red paint by this. I have photos of that, but I don't know if she would want any of that. I'd have to ask her, consent now is very important, go ahead and do that. But it was an amazing show, and the skits, there are many people now that are still on the art scene that were in that show. But as I say, I don't know if I have no permission to name who they are. I shouldn't have even mentioned the Walkers, actually. But I can't help it, it was too good a story. So I've had lots of different kinds of experience, all of which hang together little by little. I would say that Esther was probably, to be the daughter in a Mennonite family of a bishop in the Mennonite church has got to be problematic. Somewhere, unless he's a really kind gentleman, really a great guy. Well, I'm lost in thought now. Well, where were we?
I was just
You
going
can always edit this. You don't have to pictures
Yeah.
of me thinking.
No.
The thinker.
Very Rodin. The art that you're talking about right now, both yours and other artists, unnamed and or named, is it still available to be seen by the public? If someone so wants to see.
No, it's all, much of it, I have photographs of a lot of this stuff, but there is no place that this is exhibited. Yes, you can go see the people's work as individual artists now and then in shows that they'll have. I know the people, but you would have to just go to a show that they have work in. And nothing is being exhibited as the work of abused children, adult children, no. Although I would say everything in this room is probably, and there's a lot of art here that is not just mine. Look at me, that's by some African, of course, that the Shango stick. No, I can't, and I never published this book, which I'm I'm hoping before my demise I can publish this book, The Iconography of Abuse, because it's a study of how child abuse becomes metaphors in art.
Mm-hmm.
And once I got started, it became like a more than a Pandora's box. It became just a fascinating story. And the people who had grown up in this kind of family were everybody you know. I mean, Thomas Edison said that he would never have been such a great inventor if he hadn't been abused as a child. And his mother switched his legs, which was typical of children of the early 1800s, is to be switched. They would go out and even have to cut their own switch. And of course the word switch then becomes a metaphor for abuse. So the fact that his whole life was spent with switches in the sense of electric connections is not just an accident, although as a single example it may be, but when I found this again and again, that there were even making a play on words became a meaningful connection. And then I would sit and just think of artists and writers and musicians I knew and think of the most bizarre things, like Jules Verne is one of the most bizarre writers. 10,000 Leagues Under the Sea, what a weird idea. And then if you're into drinking, you realize the sea is a metaphor for alcoholism. And now this may sound, it's so obvious sounding, but it becomes so pervasive and you find it so often. Now this you cannot repeat, but I tell you that this guy Walker's, Kara's father's painting was a still life of bottles. And now lots of artists make still lifes of bottles, but when you begin to see that the bottle can be a metaphor or symbol for alcohol abuse, it begins to make sense in some really weird ways. You find bottles and think of them in ways that you never would have connected them before. Jules Verne, then I started to read their biographies to check this out. And the first page of the biography of Jules Verne the first mention of little Jules is he's in his crib as a baby in his family's home in somewhere southwestern France. And they've had a family meeting and all the family members had been there and they're all lawyers and educated people, but the morning appears and they are all lying drunk on the floor of the house. The only person awake is baby Jules, who is in his crib entertaining himself by ripping up his uncle's legal papers. And I just shut the book. I didn't even have to read any farther about Jules' background in alcoholism. The whole family lying inebriated and him ripping, okay. So then his other books are like, Journey to the Middle of the Earth. I mean, each one is crazier and wilder than the other. And then you find Thomas Edison, the light bulb itself becomes a metaphor of abuse. And you read about him and it's the same. Every time I pick up a biography, it would be Walt Disney, of course, is one of the main. He's such a great child of abuse and all of his crazy ideas. I mean, talking about liquids, take The Sorcerer's Apprentice, where the whole thing is about liquids getting out of hand, and finally inanimate objects are, the broom. You realize the inanimate object is the drunken parent, who becomes a kind of zombie-like character and is bringing water to the point, that everybody's going to drown in it, the Sorcerer's Apprentice. Well, I read Disney's biography, and there's a place where his father, who is an alcoholic, comes to see Disney's studio, and Walt is really interested in impressing the father. Like many children of abusive parents, they're still trying to please them, So the father and mother walk into the enormous Disney studio, and this is what his father says. He said, "Is this some sort of hospital or something?" Well, as a son, what do you think your reaction is going to be when your father says that about the industry that you founded? I mean, it's just like that, you know, you're put down 1,000,000 miles in one sentence by this guy. And I'm not going into any more examples, but every time I would read a biography of anybody, writers, musicians, this would come up somewhere, you know, artists. Some who were too old, you know, like the Egyptians, you couldn't read their biographies. But when you start to study ancient Egypt, you realize they were great beer drinkers. And there were certainly a bunch of Egyptians, probably quite a few, that were alcoholics. I just have no doubt about it. And if you think they look strange in those pictures of them, there's a good reason. They look strange. No, I'm sorry. Let's stop. You know, yes, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
They all look like this. Well, you got to be stoned.
Stone,
I
pyramid.
used to give lectures with my students. I mean, because these different rules for the way they figure, they had a rule for everything. That
Right.
they said the profile was the perfect way to show the face. No faces head on. So everybody was in profile. But the eye only looked good straight ahead. So their eyes are actually looking this way. There's only one way to look like that. You get stoned and your eye is going and you're standing. Only the hand facing you is worth, you never had the back of your hand. So both hands are right. It's so funny when I start to think of it. And, you know, the same thing is true of every different thing in your body. It has to, you know, so the artists were going crazy trying to figure out how, and your shoulders had to be like this, how to get, if you're going to do something with your left arm, how can you get it way out there? So if you're going to be pulling an ox by the horns, you're going to have some really strange body positions to be able to, you know, sometimes they had to break their rules, but they seldom did. They were very, and that went on for like 2,000 years. They kept that up.